Far to the northwest of the Greek world, across rugged mountains and deep river valleys, lived the Illyrians. They were not a single kingdom, but a collection of tribes spread along the Adriatic coast and the Balkan interior. Their lands stretched from what is today Albania, Montenegro, and Bosnia into the borders of Macedonia and even parts of modern Croatia. For centuries, they were known as a fiercely independent and warlike people, skilled in both raiding and defending their territory. The Illyrians thrived in a harsh environment. Their settlements were often hill forts built on high ground, giving them strong defensive positions. They practiced farming, animal husbandry, and trade, but their real reputation came from their warrior culture. Illyrian tribes were famous for their use of swift attacks, ambushes, and guerrilla tactics that unsettled their neighbors. To the Greeks, they appeared as untamed barbarians, living outside the ordered city-state system. To the Macedonians, however, they were more than just neighbors. They were a constant and dangerous threat on the northern frontier. Some Illyrian tribes grew powerful enough to form kingdoms. The most famous was led by Balkans in the 4th century BC. Balkans united several tribes under his leadership and created a strong Illyrian confederation. Under his command, the Illyrians became one of the most formidable military powers in the Balkans. They had the strength to fight Macedon directly, and for decades, they controlled large portions of its territory. For Macedonian kings, the Illyrians were not just troublesome raiders. They were a looming power that could decide the fate of the kingdom itself. This set the stage for one of the most important rivalries in ancient Balkan history. The Illyrians, with their long tradition of independence and military strength, stood directly in the path of Macedonia's rise. Before Alexander the Great could ever dream of conquering Persia, before Philip II could think of uniting Greece, the Macedonians first had to survive. And to do that, they had to face the Illyrians. For much of the 5th and 4th centuries BC, Illyrian raids into Macedonia were a constant danger. The Macedonian kings, ruling a kingdom still fragile and divided, often struggled to defend their borders. The Illyrians would descend from their mountains, plundering villages, carrying off livestock, and retreating back into their strongholds before a counterattack could even be organized. This pattern repeated so often that Macedonian rulers were forced to pay heavy tribute just to buy peace. But by the mid-4th century BC, the situation grew even more dire. Balkans, the powerful Illyrian king, had built a strong confederation that reached its peak around 385 to 360 BC. His warriors were disciplined and formidable, equipped with strong shields and spears, and they fought in a way that countered Macedonian formations. Balkans even defeated the Macedonian king Yrianss III, father of Philip II, and took control of large swaths of Upper Macedonia. At one point, the Illyrians ruled over much of the western Macedonian highlands. The Illyrians did not act alone in these wars. Sometimes they allied with rival Greek states, particularly those who wished to weaken Macedonia. At other times, they acted independently, driven by the promise of plunder and expansion. What made them so dangerous was their unpredictability. They were not bound by the same diplomatic traditions as the Greek city-states. Instead, their strength rested in bold leadership, swift movement, and their ability to appear suddenly in enemy territory. By the time Philip II came of age, Macedonia had already suffered humiliating defeats at the hands of Balkans and his warriors. One of the worst blows came in 360 BC, when Perdiccas III, Philip's brother, led an army against the Illyrians. In the ensuing battle, Perdiccas was killed, along with thousands of Macedonian soldiers, one of the greatest disasters in Macedonian history up to that point. The kingdom was thrown into chaos, its survival once again in doubt. This was the world Philip II inherited when he ascended the throne. He was surrounded by enemies, Thracians to the east, Greeks to the south, and Illyrians to the west. But it was the Illyrians, fresh from their victory over Perdiccas, who stood as the most immediate and dangerous threat. Before Philip could secure his kingdom, he had to defeat Bardalus and prove that Macedonia would no longer live in fear of its northern neighbours. When Philip II took the throne in 359 BC, Macedonia was weak, fractured, and on the verge of collapse. But Philip was no ordinary king. He immediately set about reforming the Macedonian army, introducing longer spears, the sarissa, and drilling his men into a disciplined phalanx formation that could withstand the shock of enemy charges. He also understood that Macedonia's survival depended on striking decisively against the Illyrians, who had humiliated his kingdom for decades. Bardalus, now an aging but still formidable leader, had ruled for decades and commanded enormous respect among his people. His warriors were hardened by years of successful raids and victories against both Greeks and Macedonians. When Philip demanded that Bardalus withdraw from the territories he had seized, the Illyrian king refused. The stage was set for a clash that would decide the balance of power in the northern Balkans. In 358 BC, Philip marched west with around 10,000 infantry and 600 cavalry. His army, though smaller than many Greek city-states could muster, was highly organized and disciplined. Bardalus reportedly gathered an army of 10,000 men as well, determined to crush the young Macedonian king before he could solidify his rule. The two forces met in battle near Lake Ohrid. The Illyrians fought in dense blocks, relying on their heavy shields and spears, but Philip's new phalanx was built for endurance and coordination. As the lines clashed, the Macedonian sarissas kept the Illyrians at bay, forcing them to fight at a distance they were unprepared for. Philip then used his cavalry to outflank Bardalus's men, striking their sides and cutting off their retreat. The result was catastrophic for the Illyrians. Ancient accounts claim that 7,000 of Bardalus's warriors were killed in the battle, a devastating loss. The Illyrians were forced to sue for peace. Bardalus agreed to relinquish all claims to Macedonian territory and withdrew his forces north. For the first time in decades, Macedonia was free from the shadow of Illyrian domination. This victory was a turning point for Philip II. By defeating the Illyrians, he secured his kingdom's western frontier and gained the prestige he needed to strengthen his authority at home. It also sent a clear message to neighboring powers. Macedonia was no longer a weak state to be bullied or divided, but a rising force in the region. As for Bardalus, his defeat marked the beginning of the decline of Illyrian power. Though the Illyrians remained a force to be reckoned with, their dominance over Macedonia had ended. The balance of power in the Balkans had shifted, and Philip would soon use this momentum to expand Macedonia far beyond what anyone had imagined. The crushing defeat of Bardalus at the hands of Philip II forever altered the relationship between Macedonia and the Illyrians. Where once the Illyrians had been aggressors raiding deep into Macedonian lands, they were now forced to step back and watch as Philip's power grew. The Illyrian threat had not disappeared, but it had been broken, and the Macedonians would never again be so vulnerable to them. In the years that followed, Philip consolidated his control over the borderlands. Many Illyrian tribes were forced to pay tribute or provide hostages as guarantees of their loyalty. Some were even recruited into the Macedonian army, their skills as fierce warriors now used in the service of the kingdom they had once terrorized. Philip understood the value of incorporating rather than simply destroying, a lesson he passed down to his son. But not all Illyrians accepted this new balance of power. Rebellions flared up intermittently, and different tribes resisted Macedonian authority. Yet each time, the Macedonian response was swift and brutal. The once proud Illyrians were learning that the era of their dominance was over, replaced by the steady rise of a new hegemon in the Balkans. For Macedonia, victory over the Illyrians was more than just the securing of a border. It was a test of Philip's reforms, and the success of the phalanx gave him the confidence to look beyond survival and toward expansion. With his western frontier secure, he turned his gaze south toward the divided Greek city-states and east toward Thrace and beyond. The Illyrian defeat thus became one of the stepping stones on Macedonia's path to becoming the most powerful state in the Greek world. For the Illyrians, their defeat by Philip became part of a longer story of resistance and adaptation. They remained a constant presence in the Balkans, at times rebelling, at times fighting alongside the Macedonians, and later against Rome itself. Their legacy was not erased by Philip's victory, but their role in shaping the destiny of Macedonia was undeniable. Without their decades of pressure, Macedonia might never have developed the military reforms that transformed it into a great power. And perhaps most significantly, this clash between Bardalis and Philip II shaped the world into which Alexander the Great would be born. The son of the king who broke the Illyrians, Alexander inherited a stable and secure Macedonia, free to launch campaigns that would stretch not just across Greece, but across Asia. In a way, the fall of Bardalis and the Illyrian dominance was one of the first dominoes that set in motion the rise of an empire that would change the ancient world forever. The Illyrians had once been the terror of the Balkans, but Philip II had proven that even the fiercest tribes could be subdued. In their struggle with Macedonia, the Illyrians left behind a legacy of both defiance and defeat, a story etched into the foundations of Macedonian greatness.